Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be studying together Daniel 4 verses 10 to 18, in which Nebuchadnezzar tells Daniel his dream. Let's begin by reading the text. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. So what we have is in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he sees an enormous tree in the middle of the earth. And that should bring to mind the enormous statue in Daniel 2 that the king saw in his dream in that chapter. And this enormous tree in the middle of the earth, he tells us, grows large and strong and touches the top of the sky or the heavens. Now, that the tree is large and has a top in the sky would echo the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11:4, where the builder said, "Let us build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves." And I would remind you that the word translated Babylon in our English Bibles is in the original Babel, which is the same language that is used in Genesis 11:4. So really, the word is referring to Babylon in Genesis 11:4. And we're told that they were trying to build a tower up to the heavens. And here's Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He is, we're going to see, being depicted as a tree that touches the sky. We have to equate the two things. Now, this tree is visible to the ends of the earth. This is a reach of his empire, I think. Green leaves. Remember, he was said that he was prosperous, which meant he was flourishing or luxuriant. There's abundant fruit that provides food for all. And all the animals and birds find shelter under this tree. And from it, all creatures are fed. As we will be told in verses 20 to 21, this tree symbolizes Nebuchadnezzar and his empire, which provided prosperity and protection for the people in his kingdom. Now, in Daniel 2 and verse 37, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar, as a head of gold of the statue, was a king of kings, into whose hand God had given all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky, and had made him ruler over them all wherever they lived. It is this dominion and power and might of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom that is being represented by his being portrayed as an image of the tree in his dream. The image of a tree is an important motif which appears a number of places in the ancient Near Eastern literature. It, in fact, is, I believe, used not only there, but throughout the Bible. And what I'd like for us to do is consider some of these different images of a tree to give us context to better fill out our understanding of the message that's being conveyed by Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 4. And where I want us to begin is by considering what is referred to in the ancient Near East as a cosmic or a world tree. So let's start by talking about the cosmic or world tree. Craig Keener and John Walton, in their NIV Cultural Background Study Bible, say the concept of the cosmic tree in the center of the world is a common motif in the ancient Near East. The tree's roots are fed by the great subterranean ocean. That's a part of their cosmology, the idea that beneath the earth there is a sea. And its top merges with the clouds and thus binds together the heavens, the earth, and the nether world. This image of a tree in the middle of the earth with its top touching the sky, which we find in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 4, is therefore similar to the concept of the cosmic tree, which connects heaven and earth. And this tree plays a cosmic role at the intersection of heaven and earth and is viewed as the source of provision. John Goldingay writes of this same cosmic tree, and he describes it as a lofty, preeminent, verdant, protective, fruitful, long-lived tree, which he says is a common symbol for the living, transcendent, life-giving, sustaining cosmos, or reality, or deity itself. So it's a sacred tree at the center of the earth, which symbolically links earth and heaven, like the tree of life, which grows in God's garden in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 2. This cosmic tree is a symbol for the source of life. Now, the tree itself can be replaced conceptually or at times iconographically by a god or by the king. And so the king can be conceived of as a source of life. Now, since a tree can be replaced conceptually by the king, this makes sense of Nebuchadnezzar himself being the tree in Daniel chapter 4. Now, I want you to notice that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the tree is in the center of the earth. In fact, 250 years before Nebuchadnezzar, an ancient treatise on the topography of Babylon identified that city as the link of heaven and the underworld, thereby attributing to the city a position at the middle point of the cosmos, just like the cosmic tree. Now, the only known Mesopotamian map of the world, which probably dates from just a few generations before Nebuchadnezzar, and which depicts Babylon as a large rectangular structure located near the center of the earth, and this map would have depicted all the other kingdoms as small circles that revolve around it. When we consider this way of thinking of Babylon, then Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is also a tree in the center of the land, kind of like the cosmic tree. It would link heaven to earth and would be conceived of as a source of life to others. Now, I'm trying to paint a picture here of what the thinking or the mindset would have been behind this idea of Nebuchadnezzar being a tree that united heaven and earth. Now, in addition to this idea of the cosmic tree, there's also an idea of a sacred tree, which was a concept in the Assyrian Empire or amongst the Assyrians. So another place where the tree motif shows up in the ancient Near East is in this image of a sacred tree in Assyria. Now, in Assyrian context, the motif of a sacred tree is also well known. Some have called it a tree of life, and some also associate it with the world tree. It's often flanked by animals or by human or divine figures, and a winged disc is typically centrally located over the top of the tree. The king is represented as a human personification of this tree, and the tree is thought to represent the divine order. And I'm taking this from Craig Keener's and John Walton's NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. Now, in the image that we're looking at here on the screen, we see two figures of the Assyrian king, Ashur-nasir-pal, and he's flanked by two protective winged divine spirits as they stand before the sacred tree. Now, a god in a winged protective disc is depicted above the tree, and this image you're looking at is taken from a relief displayed behind the Assyrian king Ashur-nasir-pal's royal throne in his palace at Nimrod. It's dated somewhere around 864 to 860 BC. So here again, the tree is a symbol of the source of life and is linked to the king in a way to suggest that he mediates God's life, provision, and protection to his people. So the king becomes a vehicle of the source of life. And the imagery and mindset that lie behind this image would have informed this idea of Nebuchadnezzar being a tree in Daniel chapter 4. Now, the tree in this thinking can also be replaced conceptually or at times iconographically by a god or the king. So the king is sometimes represented as a human personification of this tree. For instance, this plaque from Ashur, which is in Iraq, dated to around the first half of the second millennium, that's around the 1900s to 1500s BC, is believed to depict an anthropomorphic, that's a big word to say, it's a depiction of the tree in a human form, so an anthropomorphic representation of a sacred tree, in which you notice the king in the center holds tree branches from which the goats nibble. So iconographically, the king is replacing the tree, and the idea is that the king is the source of life, like the tree was the source of life. So this tree imagery resonates as well with the image of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis chapter 2, we're told of a tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden, from which flowed a river which separated into 4 waters watering the world. And these rivers included the Tigris and Euphrates, which would have been in the Fertile Crescent and in and around the areas of Babylon and Assyria and so on, the ancient Near East, but also 2 other rivers which would have been associated, all 4 rivers, with civilizations in Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and Canaan and Arabia, but really the then known world. So the point is that the God of the Bible was the source of life for all of these civilizations, and not their kings nor their gods. Now, this motif of the tree depicting God as a source of life actually appears a number of times in the Bible. It appears, for instance, in Psalm 1, where the man who delights in God's law is depicted as a person planted by a stream of water yielding fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither but prospers, and is compared to the wicked who are like chaff which the wind blows away. All of this is pointing to God as a source of life and blessing. It also appears in Jeremiah 17 and verse 5, where the man who trusts in God is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream, does not fear when heat comes, and always has green leaves and has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. And that man is compared to the one who trusts in man and turns away from God, who's like a bush in the wasteland and lives in the parched places of the desert, a salt land where no one lives. So again, the tree imagery is being used to depict God as a source of life, and the idea that relying on man, for example, kings like Nebuchadnezzar, is futile. And then Daniel's tree imagery in Daniel 4 is also similar to imagery used by his contemporary Ezekiel in Ezekiel 31 to depict Assyria's false pride and security. And we can have a quick read of Ezekiel 31. In Ezekiel 31 in verse 3, we read, "Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high, its top above the thick foliage. It's reaching up to the sky, to the heavens. The waters nourished it, so it gets water from beneath the earth. Deep springs made it grow tall. Their streams flowed all around its base and sent their channels to all the trees of the field. So it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased and its branches grew long, spreading because of abundant waters. All the birds of the sky nested in its boughs, and all the animals of the wild gave birth under its branches. All the great nations lived in its shade. It was majestic in beauty with its spreading boughs, for its roots went down to abundant waters." So quite similar imagery. In fact, in verse 8, Ezekiel goes on to say that the cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, and no tree in the garden of God could match its beauty. So we have that link there with the Garden of Eden. And God goes on to say that he made the tree beautiful with abundant branches, the envy of all the trees of Eden in the garden of God. So it's linking again with the idea of the tree of life. Well, Ezekiel continues. He says, "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, because the great cedar towered over the thick foliage, and because it was proud of its height, I gave it into the hands of the ruler of the nations for him to deal with according to its wickedness. I cast it aside and the most ruthless of foreign nations cut it down and left it. Its boughs fell on the mountains and in all the valleys. Its branches lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. All the birds settled on the fallen tree, and all the wild animals lived among its branches. Therefore no other trees by the waters are ever to tower proud and high, lifting their tops above the thick foliage. No other trees so well watered are ever to reach such a height. They're all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortals who go down to the realm of the dead. So we see in Ezekiel 31, Assyria being described as a great cedar, where the birds nested and under whose branches the animals gave birth, but that God determines to cut this tree down. And similarly, in Daniel 4, we will read that God cuts down the tree that symbolizes Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian kingdom, which succeeded Assyria. So what we have is this metaphor of a tree as representing a kingdom. And that is, of course, rooted in the Hebrew Bible in passages like Ezekiel 31. But you can also have a look at Isaiah 2, verses 12 to 13. But in the Ezekiel passage, Assyria has been likened to a great cedar in Lebanon. But notice there are some common elements in Ezekiel 31 with Daniel 4. For instance, its height was loftier than all the trees of the field. Its boughs became many and its branches long because of many waters as it spread them out. And all the birds of the heavens nested in its boughs and under its branches, and all the beasts of the field gave birth, and all the great nations lived under shade. The point of this imagery in both Ezekiel and Daniel is to portray the extensiveness of the kingdom of Assyria and Babylon, and those who were reliant upon it and benefited from it. And the next thing that is being conveyed is that God, who is sovereign over all kingdoms and determines their rise and their fall, as we saw in Daniel 2, can bring them down. Well, the tree motif also appears in Matthew 13, where it's used to depict the kingdom of God by Jesus. And if we read that Jesus told another parable, and he said, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants, and it becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. Here, Jesus describes the kingdom of God by using a parable of a mustard seed that becomes a huge tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. And I think what he's doing here is alluding to the tree symbolizing Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom in Daniel 4:12, under which animals found shelter and the birds nested in its branches. But unlike Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom, God's kingdom, portrayed here by Jesus in Matthew 13, will not have its branches chopped off. That is, its authority removed in discipline. Instead, God's kingdom will start small and grow to be large. So Jesus is using the tree motif to show that the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, rather than the great kingdoms of the world, the Assyrias, the Babylons, is the kingdom that really does provide protection, in which the birds of the sky will nest in its branches. So the dream of Daniel 4 fits into a larger biblical motif that great kingdoms like Assyria and Babylon will ultimately be cut down by God, and they'll be replaced by the kingdom of God under its Davidic messianic king, as Daniel teaches in Daniel 2. Remember that God would set up a kingdom that would destroy these other kingdoms and would itself last forever. Well, the tree motif also appears in Revelation 22, where the tree of death, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which represents Adam and Eve's exercise of their own kingship or autonomy from God, which led to their deaths and the curse. That tree is ultimately to be replaced in Revelation 22 by the purely divine tree of life. Now, there is another tree that we have not mentioned, and that is the cross, which is the ultimate tree of life, in which heaven and earth are united, and that tree serves as a true source of life that will last forever. Now, the point of all of this discussion about the tree in the Bible in the ancient Near East is to show that what God is saying in Daniel 4 is that God is a source of life and not human kingdoms of power. So the ancient Near Eastern, either the sacred tree or the cosmic tree, have this idea of these kingdoms and their gods and the kings themselves being the source of life on which all people would come under these tree and get life and provision. And the message of the Bible in which the tree motif is developed, and here in Daniel 4, is to convey the point that God is actually the source of life and not any of these human kingdoms or their powers. And we will see that the life and security and provision and protection which comes from Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom does not come from him as he mistakenly and arrogantly thinks, but it comes from God, who gives it to him, and it will be cut off when God, who gives it, decides to take it from him as well. Well, let's keep reading in Daniel 4 and verse 13. The king says, "In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, 'Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches.'" Now that word or expression, Holy One, again, the word holy there does not have a moral sense, but it conveys a sense of status that is set apart, which is what holy means, set apart from the human realm. So really it's referring to a divine being from the divine realm. And what the king says in his dream, he sees a holy one, really someone from the divine realm who is a messenger, a better translation perhaps is watcher, that comes down from heaven. And that divine being or creature calls out in a loud voice a decision that comes from heaven. So the decision really comes from God, but is being conveyed by a messenger of God, really something in the nature of an angel. And that decision is that the tree, which represents Nebuchadnezzar, is to be cut down, its branches trimmed, its leaves stripped, its fruit scattered, and the animals and birds that were under it were to also be driven away from taking shelter in it. And the point is that all of this provision, which the birds and the animals were able to enjoy, was the gift of heaven. And it was now going to be taken away at heaven's decree. It was not the gift of Nebuchadnezzar. So all this provision that his empire was able to give to others was not because of his greatness or his power, but it was really because God was benevolently enabling him to convey this to others. I think of a Bob Marley song here, which has the lyrics really from a proverb: "If you are a big tree, small axe will cut you down." And the idea there is when we become so inflated with ourselves, it really doesn't take much to bring us down to size. And I think this is what God is doing here with Nebuchadnezzar. Well, in verse 15, we read, "But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him." So the tree is cut down, but not completely destroyed. There's some grace there. It's bound with iron and bronze, perhaps to protect what remains. And it's reduced to the grass of the field, so it's no longer reaching to the heavens, it's brought down to earth. And then we're told, let him. So we have a transition from the image of a tree to an actual person. And now, living with the animals among the plants of the earth, this person has been brought down to earth. And quite often people will suggest that we're dealing with a rare mental disorder in which a person thinks himself a beast, either zoanthropy or lycanthropy. But I think the basic idea is that the mind of this person been changed from human to animal. Now, God is the one who had given him the mind of a human, which enabled him to be over the animals. And God, because he was sovereign, can and will take it away. And then 7 times in the passage refers to a complete amount of time determined by God but unspecified. And the idea there is that God is in control. Well, we read the decision is announced by messengers. Again, that word perhaps better translated watchers, which is a term which is used in the book of Enoch, but I won't go down that rabbit hole, though some of you are perhaps interested in that. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is a dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means. For none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So the decision is announced. It has been made by God. From verse 23, we know that. The Lord has proclaimed disaster against you. That's what verse 23 will say. But the decision made by God is announced by these messengers, these holy ones who declare the verdict. And this suggests a heavenly council over which God presides and is surrounded by divine beings, angels. So two purposes for the illness that the king is going to suffer is firstly to convey that the Most High rules over all kingdoms on earth and gives to them anyone he wishes. And secondly, that the Most High sets over them the lowliest of people. Well, if we stop there, since God even allows the lowliest of men to reign, which, as one writer puts it, it's a truism. That's a truism in the facts of history. Then a king should not be filled with pride, because it's not by the king's ability, but by God's permissive will that the king reigns. So God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and he gives them to anyone he wishes. And that's parallel to what we would have seen in Daniel chapter 2, where God could raise up and bring down kingdoms. And God sets over them the lowliest of people, and that agrees with what the Bible teaches elsewhere, that God exalts the humble. And this is demonstrated ultimately in Jesus, who humbled himself and was exalted by God to the highest place. Think of Philippians 2. And so the true kingship that God would set up that would last forever is demonstrated by this kind of servant humility that we find in Jesus. So the purpose of this illness is made plain. It is to bring low one who has forgotten his human dependence on the Most High, whose prerogative it is to decide who is to receive the right to rule. I'm quoting there from Joyce Baldwin. So the point of the dream is for Nebuchadnezzar to remember that everything he had become was because of God, and to remind him he needed to be humble and acknowledge God's role in his life, even as king. Well, Nebuchadnezzar asks Daniel to interpret the dream for him, and he declares that none of the wise men in his kingdom could interpret it for him. And this shows again the superiority of Daniel's God and the wisdom that he bestowed in Daniel and the gift that he gave to him to be able to interpret dreams. Well, in our next video, we will see Daniel's interpretation of the dream in verses 19 to 27. I look forward to your joining us then.